In the year 480 BC, the world held its breath as thunder rolled from the east. An empire moved, not a mere army, but a tide of men, horses, ships, and ambition. At its head rode a king who believed himself not just ruler, but divine instrument, Xerxes I, son of Darius the Great. To his subjects, he was the living shadow of Ahura Mazda, the rightful master of earth and sea. And now, he marched to erase an insult, the defiance of a tiny people who dared to resist him a decade before. But this was more than vengeance. It was destiny. Greece, a patchwork of quarrelsome city-states, stood as the cradle of something new. Democracy, a dangerous idea. Xerxes meant to drown it in blood, but standing between the might of Persia and the open heart of Greece was a jagged corridor of stone and sulfur, a place the Greeks called Thermopylae, the Hot Gates. There, the path narrowed to a cleft between mountain and sea, and there, waiting, were warriors carved from discipline and born to die with purpose. 300 Spartans, led by their king, Leonidas. But they were not alone. Around them gathered others, drawn by duty, prophecy, or sheer desperation. What unfolded in that chasm would become more than a battle it would be, a myth forged in bronze and fire. But myths often obscure the men who made them. To understand the fire at Thermopylae, we must follow its smoke back 10 years, to another field, another defiance, another king. It was a different king, a different decade, but the wound still festered. In 490 BC, on the windswept plains of Marathon, the invincible pride of Persia met an unexpected reckoning. King Darius the Great had launched his first invasion of Greece to punish Athens for aiding a rebellion in Ionia. What he expected was swift domination. What he received was humiliation. A smaller force of Athenian hoplites, driven not by gold or command, but by the terrifying clarity of defending one's home, clashed with the Persian host, and won. The Persians, clad in fine armor, but unprepared for the raw ferocity of a free people, broke under pressure. They scrambled back to their ships, their backs to the sea, their legend punctured like their bodies on Greek spears. Darius never forgot. Revenge became a sacred obsession, but it would be his son who bore its weight. Xerxes. Unlike his father, who ruled with calculation, Xerxes was ruled by conviction. To him, subduing Greece wasn't just retribution, it was divine purpose. He would not merely retaliate. He would engulf Greece, crush its freedoms, and fold its spirit into the fabric of his empire. The insult at Marathon wasn't merely military, it was philosophical. Greece had shown that power could be challenged, that men could govern themselves, that kings could bleed. Xerxes would not allow such dangerous ideas to live. So he began to prepare not for a battle, but for a reckoning. Not with haste, but with the slow, grinding certainty of a god building a storm. For 4 relentless years, Xerxes gathered the storm. Across the vast stretch of his empire, from the valleys of Mesopotamia to the deserts of Egypt, from the snowy peaks of Bactria to the edge of the Indus, men were summoned, conscripted, forged into an unstoppable machine. Herodotus, the chronicler of these ancient days, claimed their numbers reached into the millions. Modern scholars doubt such a figure. But even the most conservative estimates whisper of something unimaginable. An army between 70,000 and 300,000 strong, shadowed by a fleet of over 1,200 warships. This was not merely a military campaign, it was a god-king's will made manifest in flesh, wood, and iron. To make this massive march possible, Xerxes commanded nature itself to bend. A canal was carved through the treacherous Mount Athos Peninsula so his ships could sail without peril. More audacious still, he ordered a bridge of ships, a mile-long pontoon spanning the Hellespont, allowing his soldiers to walk from Asia into Europe, as if the very oceans bowed before him. When a storm destroyed the first attempt, Xerxes flew into a divine rage. The sea, defiant, was punished. His orders were unthinkable. The waters were whipped with chains, cursed aloud, and the engineers responsible were beheaded. It was theater. Yes, but it was also a glimpse into the mind of a man who believed nothing, not wind nor wave, should dare oppose him. His power was absolute, his ego untouchable, and now it marched west, Word of the rising tide spread quickly. In city-states across Greece, fear bloomed like rot. Some bent the knee before the first Persian scout arrived, convinced resistance was suicide. Others argued, factions formed, alliances teetered. Greece was not a nation, it was a family of rivals, often hostile, now staring down the abyss. And as the storm darkened the horizon, one truth became clear. Divided, they would all be destroyed. Greece had always been a land of proud cities and louder voices. Athens, Thebes, Corinth, Argos, each its own world with its own gods, rivalries, and wounds. Unity had never been a natural state, but Xerxes' advance forced the impossible dialogue. Out of desperation, a fragile alliance took root. The Hellenic League was born not from trust, but from the clarity that annihilation made allies of all men. Still, when it came to war on land, there was no debate over leadership. That mantle belonged to Sparta. The name itself stirred a kind of awe, even among their enemies. In a Greece flirting with philosophy, poetry, and politics, Sparta was an outlier, a society that existed for one reason only: war. To outsiders, they were terrifying. To themselves, they were purpose incarnate. Everything about Sparta was forged for battle. Life began with judgment. Newborns were examined by elders. Any deemed unfit were discarded like broken tools. It was not cruelty, it was doctrine. The weak would weaken the shield wall. At 7, boys left home for the agoge, the brutal state training system. There, they learned to steal, not to survive, but to learn cunning. They were beaten not for theft, but for being caught. They were taught silence, pain, obedience, and that their lives were dust compared to Sparta's honor. Cowardice was death. Worse, social death. A man who fled battle was branded, shunned, and erased. Even the women of Sparta were unlike any in Greece. They trained their bodies, sharpened their minds, and raised their sons not with lullabies, but with commands. Return with your shield, or on it. That was love in Sparta. Out of this crucible rose King Leonidas, son of the Heraclid bloodline, warrior before he was a man. He was no tyrant, no poet, king. He was duty made flesh. And when the call came, when the gods warned that either Sparta would fall or a king must die, Leonidas did not hesitate. His entire life had prepared him for one thing: to stand and never retreat. The plan was daring, born of necessity and brilliance. It came from Themistocles, the Athenian general whose mind was as sharp as any spear. If Greece could not match Persia in numbers, it must trap it with terrain. His strategy was dual: stall the massive land army at a narrow pass, and simultaneously block the Persian navy at the Straits of Artemisium. The goal wasn't victory, it was delay. Every hour bought in that narrow place would let the rest of Greece brace for the storm. The chosen battleground for the land defense was a place steeped in myth and sulfur. Thermopylae, the hot gates, a sliver of earth squeezed between sheer mountains and the restless sea. The pass was barely 100 meters wide in parts. In such a crucible, numbers meant little. Here, discipline would be the true weapon. Sparta was ready to lead, but a complication hung in the air. The timing of the invasion clashed with sacred festivals, Athens with the Olympic Games, and Sparta with the Carnea. According to law, full military engagement was forbidden during these holy days. But laws meant little when the gods themselves had spoken. The oracle at Delphi had delivered its grim prophecy. Either a Spartan king would die, or the city itself would be destroyed. Leonidas, bound by fate and law, made his decision. Sparta would not send its full army, but he would go with 300 of his personal guard. These men were not raw recruits. They were veterans, chosen not for youth, but for legacy. Each one was a father. Leonidas had selected them deliberately, ensuring their bloodlines would endure. It was a quiet, solemn gesture. These were men marching not just into battle, but into death, and they knew it. As they moved north, others joined them. Thespians, Thebans, soldiers from Phocis and Arcadia, until the allied Greek force swelled to around 7,000. A fragile spearhead, facing a flood, they arrived at Thermopylae and began fortifying the ancient Phocian wall that once guarded the narrowest part of the pass. Their backs to the mountain, their faces to the sea of men approaching. There was no escape, and none was sought. Here they would stand, and here they would decide what it meant to be free. The sky hung low with heat as the Greeks settled into their positions at Thermopylae. The old Phocian wall was repaired with hurried hands, stones piled not just for defense but for defiance. Behind it, the heart of the Allied force hoplites stood armored in bronze. These were not just men, they were human fortresses. Their cuirasses gleamed in the sun, muscle, shaped and burnished with sweat. Bronze greaves shielded their legs, and their faces disappeared beneath Corinthian helmets that turned them into faceless agents of fate. In their grip, the long spear Doru reached forward like a promise. At their side, the short Xiphos sword waited for the moment distance vanished, but it was the shield, the hoplon, that defined them. Broad, round, and rimmed with bronze, it was the linchpin of the phalanx. Shoulder to shoulder, shield overlapping shield, they formed a wall of iron resolve. Their formation, the phalanx, was more than a tactic. It was brotherhood made physical. In the tight corridor of the hot gates, such a formation became nearly invincible, and they would need every advantage. Soon, the horizon darkened not with weather, but with men. The Persian army arrived, stretching across the landscape like a living tide. Horses, banners, the thunder of thousands of sandals beating the earth. Xerxes himself ascended a nearby hill, setting up his golden throne to watch. 4 days passed, nothing. Xerxes, amused, could not fathom that so few would truly dare to oppose him. He sent envoys. "Surrender," they said. "Lay down your arms." Leonidas answered with 2 words carved into legend, Molon Labe. "Come and take them." Still, the Greeks did not flinch. They oiled their skin, as was their custom, stretched their limbs, and calmly combed their hair. To others, it looked like vanity, but to the Spartans, it was ritual preparing not just the body, but the soul. Xerxes watched in disbelief. He had crushed kingdoms, dethroned monarchs. These men were ants before the boot, but on the dawn of the 5th day, the time for patience ended. The storm broke, and history tilted forward into fire. It began not with a roar, but a whisper, the soft thrum of bowstrings pulled taut. Xerxes gave the command, and the sky darkened as thousands of arrows arced overhead. Herodotus would later write that they blotted out the sun itself. Among the Greeks, a Spartan named Leonidas is said to have smiled and replied, "Good, then we shall fight in the shade." The Greeks raised their shields in perfect unison, the bronze curve of each hoplon forming a dome that turned the storm of death into noise and sparks. The arrows fell like rain, but the line held, untouched, unmoved. Xerxes' irritation turned to fury. Arrows had failed. He would now test the Greek wall with muscle. He sent in his first wave 10,000 men of the Median and Sicyan infantry. The pride of Persia's outer provinces surged into the pass, shouting in unfamiliar tongues, their spears shorter, their shields lighter. They expected resistance. They found a wall, not of stone, but of will. The phalanx held like an iron gate. Persian blades shattered against it. Their shields crumpled under the weight of the hoplites' advance. Greek spears reached out from behind the wall, finding throats, eyes, ribs. Men screamed, fell, were crushed by those behind them. The narrow pass became a funnel of death. The Spartans fought in rotation, fresh men moving forward, exhausted warriors slipping back to rest. It was not just battle, it was choreography. Persia's numerical advantage meant nothing in that corridor of rock and rage. Hours passed, bodies piled high. The Persians could not break through. Leonidas stood in the front ranks, not commanding from the rear, but fighting as one of them. His armor splattered with blood, not just of enemies, but of brothers. Xerxes watched from his throne, lips pressed tight. This was not how it was meant to go. His men were dying in droves, and the enemy hadn't moved an inch. The first day ended with the Greeks bloodied but unbroken. Their shield wall, though battered, still stood. Xerxes had sacrificed thousands, and the gate had not opened. Night fell over the pass, cloaking the dead in silence. But the silence was not peace. It was promise. Tomorrow, Xerxes would send his best. With dawn came fury. The sun rose over a field of the fallen Persian bodies heaped where they had charged, their armor torn, faces frozen in agony. But Xerxes was not finished. His pride bled, his patience gone. He summoned the immortals. 10,000 elite warriors, Persia's finest, named not for magic, but for myth. When one fell, another replaced him instantly, creating the illusion of an unbroken line. These were no levies from distant lands. These were soldiers bred for war, disciplined, heavily armed, draped in black and silver. Their shields gleamed under the morning sun as they moved with eerie precision toward the Greek line. Xerxes believed that where others had failed, the immortals would break through. But the mountain did not widen. The pass remained narrow, unforgiving. The Greeks watched them come not with fear, but with measured readiness. The immortals hit the phalanx like a hammer against an anvil. The sound of bronze on bronze filled the hot gates. They pressed, stabbed, maneuvered with skill, but the Spartans adjusted. Their wall shifted, bent like a reed, then snapped forward again. Spears plunged, shields bashed. Then came a new twist. The Spartans feigned retreat. The wall broke apart as if in panic, pulling back down the corridor. The immortals surged after them, sensing weakness. But it was bait. At a signal, the Greeks turned, reformed the phalanx with breathtaking speed, and struck. The chase became a slaughter. The Persian elite, overextended and disorganized, were butchered with terrifying efficiency. Herodotus tells us, Xerxes leapt from his throne 3 times in fury. He had sent in gods. They returned as corpses. All day, the slaughter continued. Again and again, Persian waves broke against the wall of men. Again and again, they were repelled. The pass became a graveyard. Blood darkened the stones. By nightfall of the second day, the Persian camp was a place of silence and smoke. The myth of invincibility was unraveling. Among the Greeks, confidence swelled not arrogance, but certainty. They had found the measure of their enemy and stood firm. But as they slept, bruised and blooded, another enemy crept through the darkness. Not in armor, not with sword, but with a name that would echo through history like poison: Ephialtes. He came not with a blade, but with a whisper. Ephialtes, a name that would come to mean nightmare in the Greek tongue. He was a local, familiar with every twist of mountain and crevice of stone around Thermopylae. And for a promised reward, he betrayed it all. In the Persian camp, he offered knowledge far deadlier than any weapon. A secret path through the mountains, a goat trail called the Ephialtes Pass, winding behind the Greek position. Xerxes listened in the firelight, eyes cold with vindication. If force could not break the Greeks, treachery would. That night, the king sent his elite again, not forward this time, but up, led by his general Hydarnes. The immortals moved silently beneath the stars, Ephialtes their unwilling compass. Further up the mountain, a contingent of 1,000 Phocian soldiers had been posted to guard the trail, but they were unprepared for what slithered toward them in the dark. At dawn, rustling leaves were their only warning. Arrows flew before commands could be shouted. Thinking they were the target, the Phocians retreated uphill to mount a defense. But the Persians didn't want to fight. They bypassed the defenders entirely, slipping down the path like a blade meant for the spine. At the Greek camp below, a breathless Phocian messenger arrived before the sun had cleared the peaks. His voice shattered the silence. The enemy was behind them. In that moment, the battle changed. The narrow pass was no longer a shield, it was a trap. The Greeks were about to be enveloped. Leonidas called a council. The reality was clear. With Persians now at their backs, the position was indefensible. The goal had always been to delay the Persian advance, not die in vain. Many argued that retreat was now not only necessary, it was victory. They had stalled the largest army in history for 2 full days, inflicted catastrophic losses, and shaken the illusion of Persian invincibility. The bulk of the army could still be saved to fight again. Leonidas agreed. He ordered the allied contingents to withdraw, but he and his 300 would not leave. This was the end he had seen coming. The prophecy had spoken. His choice had been made long before his feet ever touched the hot gates. A Spartan king would die, and so he would. The sun rose blood orange on the 3rd day, casting long shadows over the hot gates. But this morning, there would be no preparation, no rituals. The Greeks already knew. The trap was closing. Xerxes, emboldened by Ephialtes' betrayal, prepared to strike from both ends of the pass. Yet Leonidas did not falter. He gathered his men, Spartans, Thespians, Thebans, and a scattering of others. There was no pretense now. They all knew what lay ahead. Still, from the city of Thespiae, 700 men led by Demophilus refused to leave. They stayed not because they had to, but because they chose to, a final act of defiance. The Thebans, in contrast, were less resolute. Accounts vary. Some say they were ordered to remain. Others claim they surrendered. But history remembers them differently from the Spartans and Thespians, who would make their stand not for glory, but because it was the only choice their honor allowed. Leonidas, facing death with the calm of a man who had rehearsed it all his life, reportedly told his men to eat a hearty breakfast, because by nightfall they would dine in Hades. And when the attack came, they did not cower behind their wall. They surged forward into the wider mouth of the pass, determined to take as many Persians with them as they could. No longer confined by terrain, the full weight of the Persian army could now descend, but the Greeks fought like men unchained from fear. When spears splintered, they reached for swords. When swords broke, they grappled with bare hands. Their teeth bared not in rage, but in refusal. Herodotus says the air itself trembled with the violence. In the heart of the battle, Leonidas fell pierced, crushed, surrounded. A brutal fight erupted over his body, the Spartans determined to retrieve it at any cost. Around them, the line began to collapse. The Persians, relentless and countless, pressed from both sides. The remaining Greeks were pushed back to a small hill, a knoll now sacred in history. There, the last of them formed a circle, shields overlapping one final time. Surrounded, exhausted, out of weapons, they still would not kneel. Arrows rained down, blotting the sky once more. This time, there was no shield to lift. And then, silence. The hot gates had fallen, but the fire they had ignited was only beginning to spread. Xerxes stood over the carnage, victorious but unsatisfied. The pass was his, the Greek line broken. The last of the defenders turned to corpses on a nameless hill. But there was no triumph in his face, only fury. Among the dead lay Leonidas, the warrior king who had defied him not with armies, but with will. Xerxes, in a final act of cruelty, ordered the body desecrated, beheaded, and crucified. Even among the blood-soaked norms of ancient war, this was seen as barbaric. But desecration could not erase legacy. Word of the stand at Thermopylae spread faster than any army. Though a tactical victory, Persia had paid dearly. Thousands dead, morale shaken. The illusion of invincibility cracked. And more importantly, the Greek allies had gained something beyond calculation. Time. Time to regroup. Time to plan. Time to strike back. A few weeks later, at the naval battle of Salamis, Themistocles lured the Persian fleet into the narrow straits and delivered a devastating blow. Persian ships, designed for open waters, became tangled and useless, while the smaller, swifter Greek triremes cut through them like blades. It was the first true turning point, and the next year, at the Battle of Plataea, the full weight of a unified Greek land army crushed the remnants of Xerxes' forces. The invasion was over, but Thermopylae was not forgotten. It could not be. The mountain pass where a few had stood against a tidal wave had become more than a battlefield. It had become legend. In its shadow, monuments were raised. The most famous bore the words of Simonides, "Go tell the Spartans, stranger passing by, that here, obedient to their laws, we lie, not as a lament, but as a vow, that freedom, even when choked in blood, could not be conquered, that courage, even in defeat, could shake the future." The legacy of Thermopylae did not remain chained to stone or carved in epitaphs. It pulsed through the veins of Greece, igniting a sense of unity that had never existed before. What had once been a loose web of city-states, distrustful, competitive, fractious, was now bound by a shared story. A story of defiance, a story of sacrifice, a story that proved that even in death, purpose could be victorious. For Sparta, it was the embodiment of their code: death before dishonor, duty before self. For Athens, it was a call to protect a fledgling idea called democracy. For all of Greece, it was proof that empire could be resisted, not by matching its numbers, but by surpassing its will. Thermopylae became the mirror in which every warrior, every citizen, every ruler thereafter would measure themselves. And beyond Greece, the tale traveled far across centuries and continents, into the mouths of poets and generals, revolutionaries and dreamers. It became a symbol for those outnumbered, outmatched, but never outwilled. From the halls of Rome to the trenches of modern wars, the story was retold. Sometimes embellished, often romanticized, but always resonant. In our age, we remember it through books, through film, through the stylized echoes of movies like 300, which, for all its fictional flourish, captured one enduring truth: that courage is louder than numbers, that a final stand, made with full knowledge of death, can still echo louder than 1,000 victories. And Leonidas, no longer just a king, became a mythic archetype. The man who walked into fate with his eyes open, who did not command from behind, but bled beside his men. His name, spoken alongside words like honor, valor, resistance, and Thermopylae, no longer just a passive stone and sulfur, but a word that now means, here we choose to stand. Time wore away the stones, but not the memory. Centuries passed, and the hot gates changed. Geography shifted, coastlines moved, the narrow corridor widened by silt and years. But in the mind of mankind, that narrow pass remains frozen in bronze. Where 300 stood, where they chose death over disgrace, where they made an idea eternal. After the war, Greece emerged, battered but unbroken. The victories at Salamis and Plataea drove the Persians back across the sea, ending their dreams of European conquest. But more than military success, it was Thermopylae that shaped the story. Not because it saved Greece by itself, it hadn't, but because it gave the fight meaning. It gave the people a myth to believe in. It showed that resistance, even when doomed, could reshape the tide of history. The tale traveled beyond its borders. Roman historians praised it. Renaissance thinkers studied it. Revolutionaries quoted it. Molon Labe, "Come and take them," became more than a taunt. It became a banner under which free people stood. From the American Revolution to the resistance against tyranny in World War II, the spirit of Thermopylae resurfaced, not as a cry for violence, but as a whisper of courage. That the measure of a civilization is not in its wealth or size, but in what it is willing to die for. In a world that often rewards compromise, the 300 remind us of the sacredness of the line that must not be crossed. And Leonidas, now etched into marble and memory, reminds us that leadership is not command, it is sacrifice. He did not ask others to die for him. He chose to die for them. The lion statue at Thermopylae stands quiet now. Tourists come and go. The battlefield is still. But if you listen closely, in the silence between wind and stone, you can still hear them. The clash of bronze, the cry of defiance. The breath of men who knew they would not live, but chose to stand anyway. Their voices don't fade, they echo. There's a strange power in defeat when it's chosen, when it's embraced with open eyes and clenched fists. Thermopylae was never meant to be a victory in the traditional sense. It was a message written not in ink, but in blood, and the world read it. Xerxes, despite his overwhelming strength, could not crush that idea. He burned Athens, yes, he crucified Leonidas, but the harder he struck, the more solid the myth became. In killing the Spartans, he immortalized them. He gave the Greeks something Persia never intended: unity through martyrdom. And that unity gave birth to resistance, to counterstrike, to freedom. In the ashes of that narrow pass rose a civilization that would gift the world with philosophy, science, democracy, and art. Thermopylae was the heartbeat that would carry through the ages, not just in grand monuments or military textbooks, but in every quiet moment where someone chooses to stand rather than yield, where a smaller voice refuses to be silenced, where a last breath is used not to plead, but to declare, "We were here, and we did not bow." The modern world still looks back at that moment. It's taught in schools, painted in murals, fictionalized in novels, and turned into celluloid epics. But strip away the layers of retelling, and you're left with something achingly human: fear, resolve, brotherhood, death, and the whisper of purpose. That small groups, when bound by belief, can hold the line against giants. That failure, chosen nobly, can become a triumph greater than conquest. Thermopylae is not just a place in Greece, it's a place inside all of us. a test of where we stand when surrender is easy and glory is impossible. I stood at Thermopylae once, not as a soldier, not as a king, but as a man, searching for meaning in ancient silence. The wind was warm that day, and the ground beneath my feet had long since shifted from what it had been in 480 BC. But still, I could feel it. Not in sight, but in weight. The weight of choices made long ago, by men who had nothing left but resolve. I imagined Leonidas not as the stone-faced warrior of legend, but as a father, a husband, a leader who looked his death in the eye and nodded. I saw his 300 not as demigods, but as brothers who chose to die for each other, not because they were fearless, but because fear had no power over men who had already accepted the price. I thought of the Thespians, whose names are so often forgotten, and yet who chose death when they could have walked away. I thought of the message carved in stone, "Go tell the Spartans," and I realized that they weren't just speaking to their own, they were speaking to us, to anyone who would one day face impossible odds and wonder if standing firm was worth it. Thermopylae answers, yes, because some defeats outlive victories, some sacrifices outshine crowns, and some stories never fade. They become stars by which we navigate the darkness. The hot gates were never just a battlefield. They were a crucible. And from their fire rose a spirit that refused to be extinguished. A spirit that reminds us no matter how overwhelming the enemy, no matter how certain the end, there is power in choosing how we fall. In that choice, there is immortality.